Hi. We are starting Clive Barker's A to Z of Horror. So I'm super excited to read this with y'all. It is incredibly in-depth and interesting. Also, since it is a coffee table book, I'm going to take some time to discuss. There will be some places where I show a picture, and then there's even like a sidebar. So just as a heads up. So Clive Barker's A to Z of Horror. Compiled by Stephen Jones. So thank you, Stephen Jones. We fear death and dismemberment. We fear pain, insanity, and loss. We even fear sexuality. And it's only by addressing these fears that we avoid living in a state of constant trepidation. Horror can speak of such things in a way that a more realistic or naturalistic genre can't. Horror is a leap of faith and imagination in a world where the subconscious holds dominion, a call to enter a territory where no image or act is so damnable it cannot be explored, kissed, and courted. Finally, why whisper it? Embraced. Clive Barker. So, contents. Right here. There's also a forward. So here's the forward. An encyclopedia dealing with the subject of horror is, in a sense, a delirious paradox. Most horror, whether it's real or fictitious, literary or cinematic, deals with the eruption of chaos into human existence, or else the revelation of its constant unseen presence. While an arrangement like A is for American Psycho, Z is for Zombie, implies order and neat examination of the whole grim business laid out for our easy consumption. Between these covers, the title suggests, is all you need to know, a handy guide to the atrocities everyone should be familiar with in case they come up over cocktails. Oh, the insights you'll be able to proffer, the droll asides on mortuary practice, the offhand remarks on the sociological significance of killer clowns. Of course, this isn't all you need to know, not by a long way. The title of this book is a convenience. Perhaps it's comfort too, implying as it does a schematic for the encapsulation of horror. But the matter at hand can never be summarized in a book or television series. The truth is far more complex. As soon as we begin to delve into the nature of horror or attempt to list its manifestations in our culture, the sheer scale of the beast becomes apparent. Horror is everywhere. It's in fairy tales and the evening headlines. It's in street corner gossip and the incontrovertible facts of history. It's in playground ditties. Ring-a-ling roses is a sweet little plague song. It's in the doctor's surgery. I have some bad news, I'm afraid. It's on the altar, bleeding for our sins. Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. It is so much a part of our lives and deaths that 100 volumes could not fully detail its presence. This isn't to say we should give up on the endeavor. After all, don't we make everything in our lives, art, love, children, in the certainty that what we create will be flawed? Why not an encyclopedia? Let's make the lists anyway, knowing they're arbitrary. Let's pretend, at least for a little while, that we consider the subject authoritatively covered. Let's even ask a few questions of ourselves, as though there might be some kind of answers to be had. We must inevitably begin with the root question, what is horror? We can all point to its presence. It's in black-jacketed books and lurid movie posters. It's in police records from murder sites and tearful recollections from battlefields. It's in our nightmares. It's in our secret ambitions. But is there any common thread or subject matter that connects all these manifestations? Maybe. Perhaps the body and its vulnerability, perhaps the mind and its brittleness, perhaps love and its absence. Whatever becomes apparent, however, the more closely we study the issue, is how misleading the term actually is. Describing as it does a response rather than a subject. Horror elicits far more complex responses than gasps and giddiness. It can shame us into recognizing our own capacity for cruelty. It can arouse us, making plain the connection between death and sexual feeling. It can inspire our imaginations, removing us to places where our most sacred taboos may be challenged and overturned. If this encyclopedia, whether on the page or on the screen, simply serves to alert the viewer or the reader to the intricacies of all this, then it will have provided no small service. Here's some Clive pictures. Do I believe it will make converts of the blinkered commentators who think that horror, particularly if it takes the form of popular entertainment, is sick or likely to degrade fine minds? No, I'm afraid not. I was at the beginning of my career a passionate believer in the need to convince people to reevaluate horror, particularly in its literary form. After all, I argued, the best of science fiction novels and spy thrillers are now viewed as literature. Why should the same respect not be paid to a fictional form that uses supernatural conceits to debate and illuminate the dark side of our personal planets? Much of the work in the genre is, of course, sheer sensationalism, but then there are 1,000 disposable hack works by every book by John Le Carre or Frank Herbert. Shouldn't we judge a genre by its finest members, not by its runts? That was the core of my position, but over the years I've largely given up on the debate. People will come to the point of view in their own time, or not at all. Of course, there's the guilty pleasure aspect of all this. That while I love well-turned phrases and great cinema, I also have a sentimental fondness for the literary or cinematic equivalent of Titus Andronicus. Indeed, there are times when the sheer artlessness of a Z-grade zombie flick can tellingly reveal the root of the genre's fascination in a fashion that a more sophisticated piece of work may conceal. Here, while we're talking about horror's appeal, may be an appropriate spot to discuss its enduring popularity. I have no new answers to the puzzle, only the strengthening sense that as our century advances and the casual cruelty of our world becomes ever more visible through the medium of television, we seem to take comfort in fantastications of that cruelty, fictions in which we may savor the very subjects that distress us in the real world. Does it empower us to do so, give us a sense of control over forces that, in truth, threaten to overwhelm us? Or are we simply warming ourselves to the blaze that's burning our culture down? I suspect a little of both. Bathing for a time in the red rivers of violence and retribution that feed the heart of this fiction may indeed wash away some of our insanity, discharging our anger by indulging our private monsters. But if it doesn't, if we're simply making ourselves all the crazier by inflaming these appetites, then I humbly suggest that it's the way of the world, and perhaps our culture in its fall from faith and certainty needs to go through a dark night of the soul in which the atrocities of street and battlefront and those conjured by storytellers become one seamless nightmare. Only this seems certain. The subject is part of our psyche from childhood, enshrined in innumerable tales as a force that helps us understand the primal nature of our battle of our natures. The abomination, whether it comes in the form of a fairy tale dragon, a serial killer, a piece of special effects, or a crazed terrorist, is a necessary part of the human story. It defines what the best in us despises, and it reminds us how close to it we come in our most forbidden thoughts. There are countless interpretations of this enigma, and, as I stated at the beginning, this book can only offer a few chosen more from personal taste than out of truly encyclopedic ambition. There's much here that fascinates me: the history of the Grand Guignol, the work of Messerschmitt, tales of lynch mobs and vampires, and the end of the world. But it's just a beginning. A collage of facts and ruminations, notes and witticisms from an extraordinary cross-section of sources, which might be extended in any one of the 1,000 different directions if a researcher chose to explore a little further. It can never be definitive. Think of it perhaps as footnotes to the grand encyclopedia that we are each of us amassing as we pass through our lives. That book will contain a number of entries under bliss, I hope, and love, but there will also inevitably be a whole host of entries under horror. If those footnotes help illuminate the moments of dread and despair that inevitably come into our lives, however careful or sheltered an existence we lead, then it is found to find purpose. And if such a high-flown intention offends you, try reading the book in the bath. You'll find upon emerging that after a certain age, say 18, the mirror may remind you how much we need the comfort of another's misery. Clive Barker. So, A for American Psycho. Quotes on the side. We all go a little mad sometimes. Norman Bates, Psycho. I think the feeling of empathy for killers has escalated since the making of Psycho and the unfortunate Ed Gein case. Janet Leigh. Edward Gein had two faces. One he showed to the neighbors, the other he showed only to the dead. Stevens Point Daily Journal. Opposite, Ed Gein is arrested, 1957. In the winter of 1957, police on the trail of a missing woman were led to a Wisconsin farmhouse by the sighting of a pickup van near the Plainfield hardware store run by the missing 58-year-old widow. What they found stunned the local community. As the facts of the case seeped into the American consciousness, they became the stuff of myth. 4 classic horror movies over 3 decades drew on the atrocities in that small town to reflect the nightmares of their own age. And each movie went a little deeper into the death and the ritual and the insanity. You know, America was probably very naive at that time and very unsuspecting, says Roy Rowan, who covered the investigation in Life magazine. And suddenly, I think this changed people's attitudes. They suddenly realized that maybe you shouldn't trust the person next door. People knew about horrors and they had seen all kinds of Frankenstein and Dracula movies, but that was a different world. This was our world. This was small town America where things like that just didn't happen. Plainfield was a typical American farm community, a small place consisting of very conservative people who were not accustomed to having a horrible crime like this committed in their midst. Police investigators believe that a sales receipt for a gallon of antifreeze found at the hardware store pointed to a suspect who was alleged to have shot Mrs. Bernice Worden with a .22 caliber rifle in her own store. The victim's body was subsequently discovered by Sheriff Arthur Shelley, hanging by its heels in the farm of 51-year-old Edward Gein. Her heart was found in a coffee can on a stove in the house. Virgil Buck Batterman was the deputy sheriff of Washura County at the time. I went out to the house with the sheriff. It was dark. We all had flashlights. The sheriff took the shed. I went to the kitchen, and Deputy Fritz went to the living room. Then the sheriff called out that he had found her hanging in the shed. Of course, seeing her there without a head and cut open like you would a deer would make anybody sick. But Deputy Fritz did get sick and went outside and sat in his squad car. He didn't come back into the house after that. Dan Hanley, a reporter for the Milwaukee Journal, remembers arriving at the scene. I came up the drive and went around the back where Mrs. Worden had been found in the shed. From a reporting standpoint, there was a problem with this story in that the things that were found were so horrible and so grisly that we couldn't write about them. Sidebar. It's a nice little town and everyone is friendly and more than willing to help their neighbors. Nobody really knew how to cope with it. Georgia Foster, Ed Gein's neighbor. I tried to make everything terribly ordinary, and even once you got inside the Norman Bates house, it wasn't a dark back alley. It wasn't all you had seen before. I was kind of bringing murder home. Joseph Stefano. Opposite, the interior of Ed Gein's home left the exterior of Gein's farmhouse. So, interior. Roy Rowan first heard about the discovery on a news flash on the radio. I remember thinking when we got to this house, would Mrs. Worden still be hanging from the rafters? What caught my attention right away in this story was the fact that it was the opening of the deer season, and here was an innocent woman, the owner of a hardware store, that had been murdered and then dressed out like a deer. This to me was just revolting. It was a stark, terrible image in my mind. Georgia Foster remembers hearing about the murder on the 10 o'clock news and asked her neighbor if she knew anything about it. She said yes, that it was Mrs. Worden that was killed, and she said, you'll never guess who they picked up. And I said, well, who was that? She said, Eddie Gein. Neither of us could believe that he would hurt anybody. We just knew Eddie wouldn't hurt a fly, so I went home and locked my door for the first time in years. I knew him pretty well in my life, says another neighbor, Bob Hill, probably from the time I was 6 years old. I don't know of anybody else that was real close to Eddie like I had been. He was a lonely man. He was quiet and withdrawn. Some people thought he was a hermit, I guess. Just a few hours after he had butchered Mrs. Worden, Ed Gein agreed to drive the then 16-year-old Bob Hill into town. The boy's parents even invited Gein in for supper afterwards. So we were in the house eating supper that night, recalls Hill. My brother-in-law came in from deer hunting, and he wanted to know what all the commotion was going on in town. There was a lot of SWAT cars and red lights flashing and that sort of thing. So I asked Ed, well, let's go to town and see what's happening. And he said, well, yeah, that'll be fine. So we got in the car and he had it started up from running, and then another car pulled up on the road and it was a county squad car. A police officer came over to our car and Ed opened his window and the officer says, are you Ed Gein? Well, I'd like to talk to you. They took him off the washoe right then and there, and that was actually the last time that I'd ever seen him. Among the filth and squalor of Ed Gein's house, the police discovered a bizarre collection of preserved body parts and human skulls and skeletons. There were 9 death masks covered with human skin, strips of skin that had been used to cover chairs, and a bowl was fashioned out of a skull. In all, Gein had collected the parts from the bodies of 15 middle-aged women. He had killed 2 of them, and the rest were taken from graves he had violated. Although the forensic experts had been involved in numerous homicide investigations, they had never seen anything like what the police had discovered on the Gein farm. I brought Mother back home with me. That was the exciting part, you see, going out to the cemetery at night and digging up the grave. She'd been shut up in that coffin for such a long time that at first I thought she really was dead. But she wasn't, of course. She couldn't be. From Psycho by Robert Bloch. We went in just as Janet Leigh's sister is descending into the apple cellar at the end of Psycho. She's going down the stairs, and we know that Mama, or rather we don't know that Mama Bates is at the bottom of the stairs, in fact. So the first 4 or 5 minutes of any horror movie I ever saw was her going down into the apple cellar, Mrs. Bates turning around, her knocking the light, all that stuff, and then Norman comes to the door dressed as Mummy, and I thought, shit, is it all like this? Clive Barker. We see that the werewolf myth does indeed run through a great many modern horror novels and movies. Perhaps the best example of all is Alfred Hitchcock's film Psycho, although in all deference to the master, the idea was there from the taking from Robert Bloch's novel, Stephen King. We got these weird tales, fantastic adventures, and a list of Robert Bloch's books and collections. As journalist Dan Hanley remembers, they'd reach into a box and they would pull out a string and it would look like it was a necklace, but it turned to be a necklace made of nipples. The upholstered furniture was made from body parts. They just couldn't believe what they were coming across. On 6 January 1958, Ed Gein was found innocent by reason of insanity on a single count of murder. He was committed to the Central State Hospital in Waupun for an indeterminate term. From the opinions of various experts, said Circuit Judge Herbert A. Bund, I think it is adequate for me to say that it does not appear that he will ever be at liberty again. Perhaps that is a desirable conclusion. In 1974, Gein asked for a sanity hearing, but his petition for freedom was turned down by Circuit Judge Robert Golmar. At the hearing, authorities testified that Gein was never a problem. He worked as a carpenter mason and hospital attendant, but he reacted poorly to the other inmates. They treat you pretty good there, he told the press. According to Harold Schechter, a professor of English at Queens College, New York, and author of Deviant, The Shocking True Story of the Original Psycho, a biography of Ed Gein. The really significant thing about Gein is that in a sense, he Americanized horror. Before Gein and the films that sprang from the obsession with this case, the monsters were populated horror films were always foreign in some way. They either came from Transylvania or Egypt or from outer space. With Gein, you really get the beginning of a very specifically American kind of horror. Gein was a real-life ghoul. He dug up the corpses of middle-aged women, hauled them back to the murk of his remote ramshackle farmhouse, and there dissected them. He turned their flesh into furniture, turned their skulls into soup bowls, skinned their faces, stuffed them with paper, and hung them in the bedroom walls like hunting trophies. Even today, when serial killing has become, if not epidemic, then certainly more commonplace than it used to be, there are crimes that still seem unprecedented in their ghastliness. A year after the police discovered the Wisconsin House of Horrors, a 41-year-old writer of pulp magazine stories sat down to write a novel in which a seemingly normal and ordinary small-town resident led a dual life as a psychotic murderer, unsuspected by his neighbors. The author was Robert Bloch, and the title of the book was Psycho. I based my story on the situation rather than on any person living or dead involved in the Gein affair, Bloch later recalled. Indeed, I knew very little of the details concerning the case and virtually nothing about Gein himself at the time. It was only some years later that I discovered how closely the imaginary character I created resembled the real Ed Gein, both an overt act and apparent motivation. But at the time, I decided to write a novel based on the notion that the man next door may be a monster, unsuspected even in the gossip-ridden microcosm of small-town life. In order to become a successful serial murderer in a close-knit rural society, a man must adopt a reclusive existence. Operating a motel in the outskirts of town seemed a solution. So I invented Norman Bates. I built him a motel and I installed a shower in it for him. Side. It still works. Every brooding, manipulative scene. I even liked the pseudo-psychological explanation of Norman Bates' condition at the end of the picture. The voice of reason attempting to make sense of insanity and failing to do anything but make Norman more mysterious. That's why I dislike the Psycho sequels. Not because they're badly made, they're not, but because Norman's mystery is eroded when the plot makes him a short-order cook. Clive Barker. The horror was the horror of the Bates Motel. The horror was the horror of the insane brutality of it all. You didn't talk about dismembering people and cutting their guts out and doing things that they do today as a matter of course. You didn't want to hear that. Films were entertainment in those days. Peggy Robertson, assistant to Alfred Hitchcock. Psycho. USA, 1916. Director Alfred Hitchcock with Anthony Perkins, Vera Miles, John Gavin, Martin Balsam, John McIntyre, Janet Leigh, Paramount, black and white. One of the most famous horror films ever made, based on the novel by Robert Bloch, best remembered for its Hitchcockian set pieces, the murder of Marion Crane Lee in the shower, the killing of Milton Arbogast, Balsam, and the top of the stairs. Perkins gives a marvelously subdued performance as the insane Norman Bates. The shocked discovery of Norman's mummified mother is overshadowed by the final scene of Norman talking in both his own and his mother's voices. During its original release, patrons were not allowed into the movie theater after the screening had begun. Great music score by Bernard Herrmann. There we go. Shortly after Psycho was published in 1959, Bloch's agent was approached by someone from the talent agency MCA with an offer to buy the book for the movies. It was a blind offer. The buyer's name wasn't mentioned. Just a flat fee of $5,000. Bloch refused and told his agent to hold out for more. A few days later, MCA came back with an increased bid of $9,500, which the author accepted. My agent got 10%, my publishers took 15%, the tax people skimmed off their share of the loot, and I ended up with about $6,250. Hitchcock got Psycho, and the rest is history. When director Alfred Hitchcock was erroneously told that Bloch wasn't available to write the screenplay, the assignment went to radio writer Joseph Stefano. It was a very strange and seemingly good time in the country, recalls Stefano, but it wasn't a good time at all. Most of us knew that. But if you think about where we were before Psycho and where we were after Psycho, it's almost as if Psycho was the robin that tells you winter is here, and it sure as hell came. It was a bigger movie than anybody thought it was going to be, including me. It became important, and I think a lot of the talk about how terrible and shocking it was because we didn't necessarily want to talk about how important all this was. A boy attracted to his mother, a boy who won't bury his mother. I mean, terrible ideas are in that movie, and they had to be made palatable. Psycho made me neither rich nor famous, but it gradually invested me with a small amount of notoriety. Robert Bloch. Poster, and then Hitchcock with Janet Leigh. Gein's psychiatrist, Dr. George Arndt, explains that Mr. Gein's mother was a very domineering woman, and he listened to her because mother was the dominant theme in his life. And when mother died and he could not raise her from the dead as he'd hoped he could, he then wanted to find replacements. If he couldn't have his mother when she was deceased, then he'd have to have a mother substitute. It was psychiatrists that said that he was so in love with his mother, that was why he had to rob those graves and bring parts of women back to remind him of his mother, says Virgil Batterman. But that's psychiatrists. Dr. Arndt also points out that Mr. Gein in his younger years had been exposed to animals being slaughtered. His parents ran a grocery store and a meat market, and he was told never to go back in that one area there. One time he did see mother with a bloody apron on, and that made a lasting impression on him. Following the success of Psycho 1960, countless other films about psychologically disturbed killers reached the movie screen. In 1974, the Canadian film Deranged depicted many of the events of the Gein case. However, it was another film made the same year, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, that would capture the public's imagination. I read The Texas Chainsaw Massacre as a fairy tale which has a great deal to do with the Vietnam War anxieties among the young, says Gein's biographer Harold Schechter. It seems to be a vision of America transformed into this vast killing machine, is feeding off its own young. My relatives that lived in a town close to Ed Gein told me these terrible stories, explains Texas Chainsaw director Tobe Hooper. These tales of human skin lampshades and furniture, I grew up with that like a horror story you tell around a campfire. I didn't even know about Ed Gein. I just knew about something that happened that was horrendous, but the image really stuck. I was thinking to create a house of ultimate horror, a house that said and smelled and tasted of death. I had to dress and redress that house many times to get the look I wanted, like someone would just roll their sleeves up and dip their hands into death itself. Aside from the murder of my insurance investigator, there is no graphic violence in the film. The rest is merely suggestion. Robert Bloch. Deranged, Canada, 1974. Director Jeff Gillen and Alan Ormsby, with Robert Blossom, Marion Waldman, Cosette Lee, Mickey Moore, Robert Warner, Pat Orr. American International, Car International, Color. Based on the same source material as Psycho 1960 and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 1974, this low-budget thriller benefits from Blossom's wonderfully deranged performance as Wisconsin murderer and necrophile Ezra Cobb, who keeps a bunch of mummified bodies, created by Tom Savini, around his house. Absolutely true, announces the opening title, and just to prove it, Leslie Carlson pretends to be a reporter who keeps interrupting the narrative with his own on-camera observations. Some scenes were cut for British. Opposite, the wonderful Robert Blossom, looking totally deranged. Deranged. Things are scary. The news is scary. The times are scary. We were young and naive back then, and we didn't know where all this was heading. But now horror is taking a different shape. Okay, so we got a little section here about Texas Chainsaw Massacre. When I discovered that Ed Gein really did some of those things, that he actually used meat hooks and was a cannibal, it truly surprised me. Tobe Hooper. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, USA, 1974. Director Tobe Hooper, with Marilyn Burns, Alan Danziger, Paul A. Partain, William Vale, Terry McQuinn, Gunnar Hansen. Vortex, Henkel, Hooper Productions, Color. Co-scripted and produced and directed by Hooper, this powerful shocker was originally banned in Britain and only released with a local London certificate. Loosely based on the real-life exploits of Wisconsin psycho Ed Gein, the amateur's performances are overcome by the film's relentless depiction of a group of teenagers being subjected to death and degradation by a bunch of backwoods crazies, including the memorable Leatherface, Hanson. Surprisingly, not as gory as it's reputed to be, with some nice touches of the supernatural, narrated by John Larroquette. The first sequel was also banned in Britain. Leatherface and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And here's good old Tobe Hooper. Sometimes it's good to be in the hands of a maniac, just so long as it's an art, not life. And what Tobe Hooper did with this film was signal to his audience that he didn't give a shit for their finer feelings. The picture, therefore, becomes an assault. Its narrative is minimal, its visuals are grittily real. To complete the achievement, Hooper created Leatherface and his family, characters whose relentless, ironic, obsessive malevolence is uniquely modern. Most monsters of the past had moments of regret or fear. These beasts know neither. Clive Barker. Today, it seems there's a glorification of serial killers. My advice to filmmakers is to be very cautious, because when the first Texas Chainsaw was made, the power of film wasn't yet realized, nor the cause and effect on values. According to Harold Schechter, what you see in that film is really a version of very old and widely distributed kind of folk story about taboo rooms or houses that you are forbidden from entering. But of course, people do enter, and what they discover there is a room full of dismembered corpses, and they themselves are then killed and dismembered. So the facts of the Geen case become assimilated in this kind of story. It's as though there is some kind of archaic level in our minds that makes sense of these horrors in terms of their stories. Senile and suffering from cancer, Ed Gein died on 26 July 1984 of respiratory failure in the Mendota Mental Health Institute in Madison, one of the Wisconsin institutions for the incurably insane that he had been his home for nearly 30 years. He was 78 years old. There's a quality of wonder about our relationship to Gein, continues Schechter. It's as though one of those figures that haunts the very darkest places of our minds has suddenly appeared in bright daylight, stepped out into the real world, like we are encountering a supernatural monster made flesh. The bad do what the good only dream. I think that sums up the fascination, not only with Ed Gein, but with horror in general. And there's a note. The Silence of the Lambs, USA, 1991, director Jonathan Demme, with Jodie Foster, Anthony Hopkins, Scott Glenn, Ted Levine, Anthony Held, Diane Baker, Orion Pictures, color. A very classy horror thriller based on the best-selling novel by Thomas Harris and a prequel to the underrated Manhunter, 1986. Foster stars as a rookie FBI agent who must use the knowledge of imprisoned psychotic psychiatrist Dr. Hannibal Lecter, an Oscar-winning performance by Hopkins as Hannibal the Cannibal, to track down Gein-like serial killer Buffalo Bill Levine, so named because he skins his kidnapped victims, with Charles Napier, Roger Corman, and Chris Isaac. This huge box office hit also won Academy Awards for Best Picture, Actress, Foster, Director, and Adapted Screenplay. And that was A for American Psycho. Next week is B for Beelzebub. And let me know in the comments if reading it that way is good and makes sense and is easy. If not, you can always give me suggestions, because the way it's formatted is not meant to be read out loud, obviously. It's coffee table book. But I am glad that he talked about all those films. They're amazing. I have not seen that Canadian one. And you like that I literally just read it and forgot. Deranged. I have not seen Deranged. But American Psycho was actually the very first scary film I ever watched, because my parents were my parents are super conservative still to this day. But it was, my TV and movie watching was very monitored. But I was allowed to watch anything that was in black and white. And so when Hitchcocktober would roll around, I'd sit down and watch all of them. Even the weird ones like, I don't know, Rope, that nobody talks about. But yeah, Psycho, such a gorgeous film. And of course, Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I'm from Texas. The gas station is about 4 or 5 hours away, and they have really good barbecue. It's so much fun. I will drop the information in for the gas station because they're pretty awesome. And in February, we're going to be there for their Cult Classic Convention doing little Spark Film stuff. So if you are in the area, come and visit us. Thank you for reading with me. Next week is B for Beelzebub. Oh, yay, Beelzebub. And then we will continue this series every Wednesday until the end of the year. Thank you so much. Bye.